It was the exposure of magic at an early age that taught me that there is more to what meets the eye, and enabled me to see my bedroom as a castle or the filled sink as a grand ocean. Then the real ocean, when I saw it, could be clearly seen as a magnificent production of God's creation. And when taught of the Bible in church, it became nearly imaginable that God separated light from darkness with his words, because my storybooks told me that such things are possible. Magic in story has the power to enlighten an individual in unique and important ways. However, many see it as irrelevant to real life, while others find it offensive to the Christian faith. Then there are those who say that fantasy is only for children. These naysayers of magic, by condemning the stories and sheltering themselves, neglect not only magic in stories, but the possibility of enchantment in real life. This world we live in is magical, meaning mysterious and extraordinary in quality and power. Fantasy stories tell us that magic is something true and allows one to see the power of virtues explicitly laid out in front of him. The earliest of magical stories were myths, whose purpose was to create an explanation for the chaos of the world. Fairy tales and fantasy came later to keep wonder relevant in a world that was beginning to believe that all knowledge was accessible. In the Middle Ages emerged authors like Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote Arthurian legend, and Giovanni Straparola, who wrote the first literary fairy tales. Many more fairy tales emerged during the Enlightenment, a time of rapid intellectual breakthroughs and scientific discovery. Amidst this time, authors of old enchantment sought to harbor the value of wonder. The reproach of magical stories was largely influenced in the 18th century by the rising fear of sorcery in the Christian community. Incidences like the Salem witch trials grew a paranoia and hatred of anything resembling the supernatural outside of God. Following, authors like David Hume began to spread ideas like, no wise man will believe in a miracle, since no evidence is sufficient to prove them. Later, in the 20th century, authors adopted the concept of realism, the idea that things ought to be depicted solely as they are. Magical themes are superfluous obstacles that distract from the truth. Now, into modern times, we have those who have come to embody the beliefs of the formerly noted realists and Christian critics. These people are like those who create the websites for 10 Arguments Against Harry Potter, saying that the world of witches and wizards is glorified and the world of humans is degraded, and that a reader's ability to discern between good and evil is blocked out by emotional manipulation and intellectual confusion. These people fear that their reality will be tainted and that their faith will suffer. But this is far from how one ought to view fantasy. Magical stories are deserving of acceptance and praise because they reveal the divinity of God, rekindle wonder, and convey important meaning. In their use of magic, fantasy can reveal to us an acceptance of God's great mystery and evoke in us the proper awe one ought to have for God and his creation. Magic is also an avenue to understanding important values. What virtues one may not comprehend, enchantment can teach in a simple and beautiful way. Magic lends wonder to the facts. Believing in scientific fact without also believing in its divine inspiration leaves one lacking in proper awe of creation. But by accepting the role that magic can play in reawakening our wonder, one can come to accept the world as truly divine. Magical stories obey their own internally consistent laws that, however, defy the laws of the human world. It is in this circumstance that one comes to realize that things do not have to be the way they are, but God has made them so, and that is what makes them miraculous. From here is realized the depth of creation. Magic reveals to us the majesty of God and conveys important messages. But in order to understand this, one must first be able to recognize that the Bible and our faith is a testimony to true magic. Genesis 1 tells us that, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. He separated land from water, light from dark, and created life. This chapter in itself is unfathomable in its mystery and wonder, and yet Scripture tells us that the Genesis story is true, and God said it was good. We are participating in a divine story, a story of true magic. The Nicene Creed calls us to affirm that God created all things, visible and invisible, that Christ was born of the Virgin Mary, and that after being crucified, on the third day he rose again. These things we believe in are just about unbelievable for how they defy human conception of what is possible. However, we believe in them, and therefore we must affirm magic. And by allowing ourselves to call God magical, we illuminate how magnificent and important our faith is. Secondly, in order to understand why magic in story is good, one must come to recognize the universe as magical. We have miracles occurring at our fingertips every day, and one should recognize them as such. Award-winning scientist Richard Feynman said, "Nature is absurd from the point of view of common sense, and yet it fully agrees with experiment. So I hope you can come to recognize nature as she is, absurd." Just because we know that the grass is green and the sky is blue doesn't mean we understand why it is that way. In the words of G.K. Chesterton, "First I found the whole modern world saying that everything is as it must have always been. The leaf on the tree is green because it could have never been anything else. Now, the fairy tale philosopher is glad the leaf is green precisely because it may have been scarlet. He feels as if it may have turned green precisely before he looked at it. He is pleased that the snow is white on the strictly reasonable basis that it may have been black. The natural world encompasses a grand amount of mystery. But the problem is, often when one claims to know the science behind something, the wonder about it is lost. Gravity, for example, is something often discarded as commonplace. But the fact that God created an invisible force that holds all earthly things in its proper place at all points in time is something that should be seen as wildly magical, mysterious and extraordinary in quality and power. One only needs the open mind to see it. By witnessing magic in stories and coming to recognize it, one can realize the enchantment that is in reality. Through the eyes of a child, anything is possible. Every day he finds a new wonder. To the baby who first discovers his toes, he is filled with just as much awe as if, to us, they had popped right off and danced around. This is the way in which God brings a human into the world, without preconceived notions, in awe of all creation. When people of all ages read magic and story, they are brought back to the wonder-filled mind of a child so that one may be able to see the world as God intended. One article titled "Finding Neverland" says, "As C.S. Lewis viewed it, imagination is what gives humankind the rationale for trusting reason in the first place, uncovering the gestalt of life's meaning, its enchanted core. And simply put, to re-enchant is to uninhibit the seeker who wishes to embrace the spell cast at the beginning of this cosmos, to see the world as it once was and as it may well still become. For this reason were magical stories written, to give people the avenue they need to break their inhibitions and recognize real wonder and possibility. Often it is said that anything that is real can be seen and understood. If this is what is being taught, then the process of learning is missing the fundamental lesson of mystery, something magic can teach us best. In the words of Peter Pan, every time someone says, "I don't believe in fairies," there's a fairy somewhere that drops down dead. The problem is that because we are already able to know so much, we have inferred that we can therefore know it all. And it must be known that even the things that are not able to be seen or understood in this moment are still possible. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the Pevensey children confront their professor with a problem. Their youngest sister has been lying about a world she found in the back of a wardrobe. The eldest, Peter, says, Logically, it is impossible. The professor sighs and responds, "What are they teaching in schools these days?" The professor understands that the belief that we are able to know it all is extremely dangerous and intrudes on the natural wonder of mankind. The Pevensey children do, in fact, find a land in the back of the wardrobe, and thus begins the Narnia adventures. Harry Potter, too, believed he knew his world, and it had nothing particularly special to offer. Until Hagrid arrives and tells him that he is capable of immense power. He takes him to gather materials for his wizarding school. They walk down everyday streets in the familiar city until they come to an alleyway. Here, as the story tells, Hagrid tapped the wall with the point of his umbrella 3 times. A small hole appeared. It grew wider and wider until suddenly they were faced in a giant archway that opened into a cobblestone street that twisted and turned out of sight. "Welcome," said Hagrid, "to Diagon Alley." It is in this moment that Harry comes to know a whole other world living inside his own. Harry Potter encourages the worldview that the impossible is near and worth exploring. According to Child Development Institute, children do not begin to develop abstract thought until between the ages 11 and 12. This means they are not capable of fully understanding many large ideas like death and virtue. Bruno Bettelheim, child psychiatrist, said, "When children are young, it is literature that carries information best." He further explains how many books meant to reach the mind of a child today are insufficient. In order to enrich his life, it must stimulate his imagination. Instead of telling a child to be courageous, something he may not fully understand, we show him a knight who risks his life to defeat a dragon to save his kingdom. The grandeur of the dragon vividly portrays the significance of struggle and conquest. The child hearing the story will try to act in the way of the character, courageous. If the knight can stand up to the dragon, then he can stand up to a bully. Courage is something difficult to explain but easy to demonstrate through magic and story. Advanced tales like Harry Potter can convey the same kind of important meaning. In The Sorcerer's Stone, by recounting the battle between 2 wizards and the death of Harry's parents by a fatal spell, Dumbledore is able to communicate the weight of love and sacrifice. He says to Harry, "Your mother died to save you. To have been loved so deeply, even though the person who once loved us is lost, will give us some protection forever. Voldemort, full of greed, hatred, and ambition, could not touch you for this reason. It was agony to touch something marked by something so good." In this moment, one of any age reading this story is able to see not only that love and sacrifice are good things, but how and for what they are good. Dr. Bruce Edwards says that enchanted tales take us through a literary portal into a world more enrapturing than our own, so that we may witness justice reigning and the good, the true, and the beautiful honored and celebrated. Magical stories are participating in heavenly things, creativity and imagination. The whole universe is a product of God's own imagination, and made in His image, He granted us with His unique abilities to imagine and create. With the creation of new worlds, creatures, and the telling of adventures, magical stories are prime examples for how one may use these gifts we have been given. Science and critical thinking are good things and should be taught and developed. The problem is believing that these 2 things can resolve the wonder that there is in the universe. Magic does not neglect the good of scientific knowledge. It instead adds to them the question that deserves to be asked: what if? Magic in stories is fruitful for one of any age. But this is not to say that one should have the mentality of a child his whole life. There is a difference between being childish and childlike. The first refers to the inability to grasp mature concepts and ideas. The second, childlike, is what God and what magic calls us to be: open, amazed, and vulnerable. C.S. Lewis said, "When I was 10, I read fairy tales in secret, and I would have been ashamed to have been caught doing so. Now I am 50, and I read them openly. Because when I became a man, I put away childish things, including the desire to be very grown up." As in all things, there are exceptions. There may be magical stories in which Christian values are explicitly neglected. These, I would say, ought to be disregarded. However, my hope is that through a thorough explanation of the goods of magic, one may come to be able to better recognize how often magic is a positive influence, and therefore not neglect these stories for improper causes. As we age, sin takes its toll on the physical body. We may become, in our hearts and our minds, just as we may look: small, shriveled, hard, and inflexible. Or we can return to God with our souls in even better condition than when we came, in more awe and more amazement at Him and His creation. It is through magical stories that one can develop in the way God has called us to be. We are each participating in a divine story. Magical stories bring us to realize the enchantment of that story and makes us the childlike followers of Christ that we are called to be. Thank you.